"So you think you're smart, then translate." The director laughed at the janitor, but then Marcus Johnson moved through the empty hallways of Jefferson High School like a shadow, seen by all, noticed by none. At 38 years old, he had spent nearly 5 years as the school's custodian, pushing his mop bucket through corridors filled with adolescent voices and indifferent stares. No one asked him about his day, no one lingered in conversation. To most, he was just Marcus, the guy who cleaned the mess after lunch or fixed the jammed paper towels in the restrooms. That was fine with him. Mostly, each morning he arrived before sunrise, long before students began filing in with half-awake eyes and earbuds. He liked those quiet hours. The click of the keys as he unlocked the classrooms, the rhythm of the mop on linoleum floors, even the gentle hum of vending machines, it all offered him a kind of peace. But beneath that calm, under the grey custodial uniform and behind his calm demeanor, was a mind that had once known the smell of old libraries, the hum of academic debate, and the thrill of theoretical puzzles. Marcus had been a scholar once. Promising one. At one time he could have explained linguistic relativism in 3 languages, quoted Derrida and Foucault from memory, and led graduate seminars on translation theory. But that was a lifetime ago, before the betrayal, before the accusations, before academia slammed a door in his face that he never fully tried to reopen. He didn't talk about that past, not because it hurt, though it did, but because there was no room for it in the present. People saw what they wanted, and most people, like Principal Daniel Whitaker, saw only a mop and a man behind it. Whitaker had never spoken to Marcus beyond the perfunctory. "Clean this up. That room's locked. Or the gym needs mopping after the assembly." The man walked the halls like hewn every brick, his voice sharp and impatient, the type of authority figure who judged people by job titles, not by character. The teachers were no different. Some offered polite nods, others didn't bother. Even the students, who were often kinder in surprising ways, knew little about the man who quietly fixed broken lockers and gathered lost notebooks. Once, a 9th grader had asked Marcus for help translating a few Spanish phrases for a report. Marcus corrected the grammar softly and handed it back with a smile. The girl never asked again. Maybe she thought it was a lucky guess. It wasn't. And this particular Thursday, Ohio's spring skies hovered gray above the school, with rain threatening from every direction. Marcus was waxing the floor near the auditorium when he overheard snippets of conversation. The school was hosting an international delegation, exchange students from France, visiting for a cultural event. Posters had been up for weeks, and the EJI administration was scrambling to make a good impression. A few students walked by him, buzzing with excitement. "Dude, they speak like zero English. Ms. Larson said they're bringing a translator. Fancy stuff." "Yeah, well, hope the food's not mystery meat today." Marcus smiled faintly and continued working. Inside the main office, Principal Whitaker paced with irritation. The translator, hired through the district, was stuck in traffic. A group of French students, along with their 2 chaperones, had already arrived and stood quietly in the lobby. Whitaker tried to mime something, pointing toward the auditorium, his patience thinning with each awkward gesture. Mrs. Clark, the vice principal, whispered something about using a translation app. A teacher tried to recall her high school French and failed miserably. And Marcus, mop in hand, paused just outside the open door listening. He could hear the polite but confused murmurs from the French students. "Où est la salle de conférence? Qui est cet homme en costume? C'est vraiment embarrassant." They were trying to understand, trying to be gracious. He recognized the tension in their voices, the same kind he once heard in lecture halls when foreign students struggled to follow discussions. Marcus didn't plan to speak. He never did. But something inside him stirred. Maybe it was the memory of being invisible. Maybe it was the disdain in Whitaker's voice. Maybe it was just time. He stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said softly, clearing his throat. "L'auditorium. Je peux vous y conduire si vous voulez." Vous cherchez. Every head turned. The French students blinked, then smiled in recognition. "Ah oui, merci beaucoup." Mrs. Clark stared at him like he had grown an extra limb. Principal Whitaker's eyebrows climbed. "You speak French?" Marcus nodded. Among other things, that might have been the end of it. He could have shown them to the auditorium and returned to his mop. But Whitaker, clearly unsettled, gestured toward a folder on the counter. "If you're so smart," he said with a smirk, "how about you translate this?" He handed Marcus a dense academic pamphlet, the welcome guide prepared in English for the event. Marcus took it calmly, scanned a few lines, and began translating aloud. His tone was clear, his pronunciation flawless, his cadence smooth. Every syllable carried confidence, not arrogance but precision. The room was silent. Even the French chaperones, both teachers themselves, nodded in approval. Whitaker said nothing. His smirk faded. Marcus handed the pamphlet back, murmured a quiet, "Excuse me," and walked away. But the hallway no longer felt so empty, and neither did the silence that followed him. The morning after the translation incident, the school buzzed with subtle chatter. Whispers spread faster than the announcements over the intercom. Students who had witnessed the moment at the front office shared their version with classmates. Teachers raised eyebrows during coffee breaks. "Did you hear about the janitor?" They asked one another with disbelief creeping into their tone. Apparently he speaks fluent French, and not just basic stuff, real academic French. Marcus arrived that morning as he always did. Before dawn, keys jingling in his hand, uniform pressed and spotless, face composed. But the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just the students nodding to him in the hallway, or the subtle glances from faculty members. It was Thessalon's that seemed to precede him now, not because he was ignored, but because people were watching. He noticed the change and said nothing. As always, he moved about his duties with care. He cleaned the teachers' lounge, checked the heating vents in the library, swept the stairwells, and wiped down the cafeteria tables. But the quiet observation trailed him, a new presence in the corridors. By mid-morning, the French guests had resumed their schedule, touring classrooms and meeting with student groups. One of the chaperones, Madame Lefebvre, found Marcus near the main hallway, adjusting a faulty light fixture. She approached him with a warm smile and greeted him in French. They spoke for a few minutes, brief, cordial, but full of the kind of fluency only long-time speakers share. When she returned to her group, she whispered something to another teacher, who laughed gently and glanced toward Marcus with a look of new respect. Inside the administrative wing, however, the mood was different. Principal Whitaker sat at his desk, fingers tapping rhythmically against the mahogany surface. He had barely slept the night before. The image of Marcus standing in his office, translating flawlessly, gnawed at his pride. A custodian had not only spoken a language Whitaker barely recognized, but he had done it with confidence. Worse, in front of visiting educators. He opened the file drawer labeled Staff Records and flipped through until he reached Johnson, Marcus L. The contents were sparse, standard hiring forms, background check clearance, work evaluations, all solid, unremarkable. There was no mention of a higher education degree, nor flags, no surprises. That in itself felt suspicious. A knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Clark. "He's on the second floor," she said. "Still doing custodial rounds?" Whitaker asked. "Yes, but—" she hesitated. The French teachers asked if he could help with the closing remarks later. "They said he's the only one who actually understands their questions," Whitaker scoffed. "That's absurd. We hired a certified translator. She'll be here before lunch." "They've requested him anyway," Mrs. Clark added. "They said it would be more natural." The principal waved her off. "I'll handle it." Less than an hour later, the event moved to the library for a cultural exchange activity. Students from both countries sat in small groups, sharing games, snacks, and vocabulary lessons. The atmosphere was light, the kind of cross-cultural engagement schools dreamed of hosting. Marcus passed by the open doors, pushing his cart loaded with cleaning supplies, when a group of French students waved him in. They remembered his help from the day before and greeted him enthusiastically. He stepped inside, offering a brief greeting, then crouched to adjust a projector cord tangled near one of the tables. Principal Whitaker saw this from the hallway and entered swiftly. "Mr. Johnson," he said, voice overly loud, "we need to have a quick chat." The room fell silent again. Marcus stood slowly, meeting the principal's eyes. "Of course." Whitaker gestured for him to follow, They stepped into the hallway, and Whitaker shut the door behind them. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," he began, "but this school has procedures. You don't just walk into a professional setting and start speaking over certified staff." "I was invited by the guests," Marcus replied calmly. "They asked for assistance." "You're a janitor," Whitaker snapped, his voice cold, clean. "Let the professionals do their job. You don't translate, you don't present." Hugh Marcus remained composed. Understood. But something had already changed in Whitaker's eyes. He wasn't just angry, he was threatened. That afternoon, just as the translator finally arrived and the event prepared to conclude, Whitaker made a decision. He stood at the center of the library, facing the delegation. With a smile too wide to be genuine, he raised a hand for attention. "Before we close today's exchange," he announced, "we thought it would be fun to try something spontaneous. A test, really, since our dear custodian, Mr. Johnson, surprised. Yesterday with his linguistic talents, I've brought a small excerpt from one of our advanced French literature courses. Let's see how he handles it." A murmur passed through the room. Marcus, who had returned to the hallway, heard his name and paused at the doorway. The French chaperones looked puzzled. Madame Lefebvre raised a brow. Whitaker held up a sheet of paper. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice oozing mock generosity, "if you would join us." Marcus stepped into the room slowly. His expression revealed nothing. He took the paper from Whitaker's hand and looked down at it. A dense paragraph from Montaigne, full of classical French structure and idiomatic complexity. Clearly chosen to confuse or humiliate. He began to read. His voice was steady, measured, unhurried. Each line came with rhythm and understanding, as if the words weren't foreign but familiar. He didn't just translate, he interpreted, weaving meaning between the lines, ensuring the cultural essence was preserved. When he finished, the room was still. Madame Lefebvre clapped softly. Then one of the French students joined in. A ripple of applause spread across the room. Marcus returned the paper to Whitaker. "Anything else?" he asked. Whitaker's jaw tightened. "No, that'll be all." As Marcus stepped out, the librarian, a reserved woman in her 60s, whispered he, nodded but said nothing. Well done, the challenge had been made. And it had been met without a tremble. Behind Whitaker's polished smile, something had cracked. Over the following days, the atmosphere at Jefferson High remained unusually charged. The French delegation departed with warm farewells, taking with them glowing impressions of their host school and vivid memories of the unexpected translator in a custodian's uniform. Several teachers mentioned Marcus in passing, their tone softening, curious, cautious. The students were less subtle. A few even started calling him Professor Marcus in jest, which he accepted with a nod and a smile. But in the principal's office, behind the heavy wooden door marked Administration, curiosity had curdled into resentment. Principal Daniel Whitaker had not forgotten the moment Marcus flawlessly translated Montaigne in front of 24 witnesses. To him, it hadn't been a display of talent, it had been a challenge. A janitor had stood in the spotlight and the crowd had applauded. That was not how the hierarchy of a school was supposed to work, not in Whitaker's mind. And so, alone, in his office, he opened his laptop and began to dig. The staff record contained nothing but the standard background check and employment details. There was no formal higher education listed, no suspicious omissions, no past employers of note. Marcus had applied through the district's secondary hiring portal, stating that he had previously done freelance maintenance work, but Whitaker didn't believe in facades that neat. There had to be more, something hidden. He began making calls. First to the HR department, asking for any records or prior applications, then to facilities management, posing questions wrapped in professional language but fueled by a private agenda. He asked if Marcus had ever mentioned previous careers, hinted at other skills. He smiled when he got vague answers. That meant there was something. People without secrets didn't inspire confusion. Later that week, he invited Mrs. Clark into his office. The vice principal, a meticulous woman with a stern presence, listened as he laid out his suspicions. "I want to know who he is," Whitaker said. "Truly, where he came from. Why someone that articulate and educated is scrubbing floors. It doesn't add up." Mrs. Clark folded her arms. Maybe he chose a quiet life. It's not our business. Whitaker's smile was tight. Everything that happens in this building is our business. If there's a reason he couldn't keep a job in academia or education, we need to know. If there's a history, it's better we uncover it now. Clark did not respond. Not with agreement, not with protest. She left his office without another word. Whitaker, however, was already composing an email to a private background check firm. Across the school, Marcus noticed the change. Tasks that were once routine became overly supervised. He was assigned to cover overlapping shifts, perform additional inspections, even double back on rooms he had already cleaned. The notes left in his custodial logbook became more demanding, more specific, always from administration, never signed. Some messages were clearly meant to frustrate. Re-clean room 304. Teacher reported odor. Replace filters in all vents. No exceptions. Lunchroom corners need scrubbing again. He complied without comment, but it was in the small gestures that Marcus felt the shift more acutely. A faculty member roused to nod politely now avoided his gaze. Two students who once waved now looked uncertain. Whispers followed him in the halls, not malicious but tinged with curiosity, as if his presence had taken on new meaning. He was no longer invisible, and visibility, he knew, was dangerous. It wasn't long before he was summoned to a behavioral evaluation. A policy-justified meeting meant in truth to apply pressure. Mrs. Clark was present, along with a counselor and an HR liaison. Whitaker observed silently from behind a small desk, his expression unreadable. "We're conducting periodic reviews of staff performance," the counselor explained. "Standard protocol." Marcus nodded. "Of course. And what do you feel is your role in the school's culture?" she asked. "To maintain order, safety, and cleanliness," he replied. "Safe environment. To ensure students and staff have a... and beyond that?" Clark asked. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it had an edge. "I believe everyone contributes," Marcus answered carefully. "Always seen." Even those whose jobs aren't Whitaker leaned forward slightly. "Do you feel that your recent actions, stepping into instructional or communicative roles, exceed the boundaries of your position?" "I stepped in when help was needed. I did not seek to replace anyone," Marcus said. Silence. The meeting ended with no action taken, but the message was clear. Whitaker was watching. That night, Marcus walked home through the quiet neighborhood, the air crisp with early spring chill. His apartment was modest. One bedroom, sparse furniture, bookshelves heavy with texts in multiple languages. He removed his uniform, hung it neatly by the door, and sat at his desk. From the drawer he pulled out a folder thick with documents, old university transcripts, letters of recommendation, research papers. At the top was a letter of dismissal. Faded ink, accusations that had never been proven, yet had ended a promising career. He read it again, not out of pain, but out of preparation. They were coming for his past, and he was ready. By the following Monday, the school corridors pulsed with an unspoken tension. Marcus resumed his duties with the same quiet precision he had always displayed, yet his presence now seemed to pull invisible strings. The school's routine had absorbed him for years without friction, but now each step he took felt like it was leaving a footprint in freshly laid cement. It wasn't overt. No one pointed fingers, no one shouted, but subtle shifts accumulated, like pressure behind a dam. The morning announcements were muffled that day, half heard through the intercom as Marcus restocked paper towels in the East Wing. His schedule, once regular and structured, had been rewritten again. The new rota required him to be in 3 places at once, covering both the gymnasium and the library wing before second period, while also overseeing maintenance checks for an aging boiler. When he questioned the overlap, the answer came clipped from the facilities coordinator. New policy, nothing personal. Inside the gymnasium, he found a stack of cleaning supplies hastily dumped in a corner. Supplies he hadn't ordered, some of them already open, leaking. When he checked the log, his initials had been forged. Elsewhere, the janitor's closet near the science wing was locked from the inside when he arrived, forcing him to delay part of his duties. That afternoon, a teacher reported a missed task, a trash bin allegedly left full after lunch. Marcus remembered emptying it. Each of these moments was small enough to be dismissed as coincidence. Taken together, they formed a pattern. Students continued to greet him with cautious admiration. One girl even handed him a handwritten note in the hallway. It read simply, "You're cool, don't let them change you." He thanked her with a nod, slipping the note into his shirt pocket, but their warmth was balanced by the cold eyes of the administration. Teachers whispered less when he entered the break room. The front office staff avoided eye contact. Even the librarian, who had once complimented him, now offered only brief glances as if afraid to be seen engaging too much. Midweek, Marcus was called again to Whitaker's office. The room smelled faintly of polish and stale coffee. Whitaker stood when Marcus entered, but didn't offer a seat. "There have been concerns," the principal began, his voice deliberately neutral, but still worth addressing. "Nothing formal." Marcus remained still. "What kind of concerns?" Whitaker walked slowly around his desk. "That perhaps the attention you've received lately is disrupting the school's balance. Some staff feel uncomfortable. Some question your place here." "My place here hasn't changed," Marcus said calmly. "Only their perception of it," Whitaker smiled without humor, "affects performance. Perception drives morale, Mr. Johnson, and morale in turn." "I haven't missed a single duty," Marcus replied. "Every task assigned has been completed." Whitaker waved a hand. "I'm not accusing, I'm advising. There's a reason institutions work the way they do. Hierarchies matter. Clarity of role matters. When people start stepping outside of their lanes, chaos follows." Marcus stared at him for a moment, then said, "Connection. Understanding another language isn't chaos. It's a pause." Whitaker stepped closer. "Let me be clear. I don't care what degrees you may or may not have. What interests me is what you're doing with that knowledge now, and whether it's in service of this school or your own little performance." Marcus did not respond. "You may go." Outside the office, Mrs. Clark stood by the water fountain, holding a folder. As Marcus passed her, she turned and held his gaze. Something in her expression had shifted. Less hardness, more calculation. She watched him until he turned the corner. That evening, as Marcus returned home, he found an unmarked envelope slipped beneath his apartment door. Inside was a printed document, his own employment record with new annotations. One line stood out, highlighted in faint red. "Under review, employee conduct and role boundaries, initiated by administration." He folded the paper carefully and slid it into the back of the folder he kept locked in his drawer. The message was clear. Whitaker was building a case, but Marcus had endured worse. The next morning, Marcus took his time arriving at the school. He stood for several minutes across the street, watching the building as the early light crept up its brick facade. Inside, routines would be grinding into motion, bells ringing, students jostling through lockers, teachers scanning their lesson plans. And somewhere in the administrative office, a man was preparing another trap. Marcus crossed the street and entered the building, through the back service door. In the custodial lounge, he found his uniform folded and placed differently, the buttons misaligned as if someone had handled it. His locker stood slightly ajar. Inside, nothing was missing, but something had been moved. The copy of Camus he kept on the top shelf now rested on the bench. He sat down and exhaled slowly. At that moment, a knock came at the door. It was the school counselor, Miss Alvarez. Her visits were rare. "I wanted to speak with you," she said, off the record. He gestured to the bench. She sat beside him, silent for a few moments before speaking. "People are talking, Marcus. Not all of it is bad. Some staff are just confused. The principal is pushing hard for answers, but others are asking different questions. Such as, why a man like you is here, what you're really hiding." Marcus looked at her. "And you?" "I think people don't hide because they're guilty. Sometimes they hide because they were burned when they stood in the light." He said nothing. She stood. "Over. You're not alone, Marcus. Just don't let them make you forget why you started." As she left, Marcus leaned back against the cold tile wall and closed his eyes. The trap was tightening. But he had not yet begun to fight. The atmosphere in the school had begun to shift, not just in mood but in the rhythm of its daily life. It was a subtle dissonance, like a piano slightly out of tune. The students sensed it in the way teachers paused mid-sentence during staff room conversations when Marcus walked by. The staff felt it in the silence that followed any mention of his name. Principal Whitaker moved through the halls with his usual rigid precision, but there was a sharper edge to his instructions, a clipped finality to his tone that revealed the tension he carried. The school was no longer just a workplace. It had become a battlefield of unspoken narratives. Marcus continued to work without protest. He repaired what was broken, swept what was dirty, and polished what had dulled. But even as he performed his duties, he remained alert to every glance and every whisper. He moved like a man who knew a storm was approaching but refused to flee. The folder in his apartment remained untouched, its contents memorized long ago. Then, one Thursday morning, the storm cracked open. A guest lecturer was scheduled to speak in the auditorium as part of the school's newly implemented academic Inspiration Series. The initiative had been spearheaded by Mrs. Clark months before, a program inviting local intellectuals, professionals, and academics to engage students in topics outside the regular curriculum. That morning, posters hung near every hallway, displaying the name of the invited speaker, Professor Harold Benton, Chair of Linguistics at a nearby university. Marcus noticed the name while wiping down windows near the cafeteria. The letters were clear, black on white, but they struck him like thunder. Benton, a name he hadn't heard aloud in over a decade. A man he had once admired, once debated, and once trusted, before everything had unraveled. Marcus said nothing. He finished the windows, returned the supplies, and headed for the boiler room, where a maintenance report awaited. But inside, his thoughts twisted tightly around them, emery of conference rooms, chalkboards filled with phonetic maps, long debates over the politics of translation. Benton had been one of the few who understood Marcus's work back then, or so he thought. Later that day, as students gathered in the auditorium and staff took their assigned seats, Marcus remained near the double doors, sweeping slowly and unobtrusively. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation. When Professor Benton stepped on stage, the audience applauded politely. He was older now, his beard streaked with grey, his voice rich and measured. He began his lecture on linguistic evolution, tracing connections between language and identity, migration and social structure. The students listened, some rapt, some barely awake, but the message resonated. Benton had always been a compelling speaker. As he spoke, his eyes scanned the room and then paused. He saw Marcus standing near the exit, mop in hand. A beat passed, then another, and Benton smiled. He continued his lecture, but now added anecdotes about past students. "I once had a young man in my class," he said, "brilliant, sharp as a blade, knew 6 languages by the time he was 25. He once challenged me on a theory of semantic drift and actually won the argument. One of the few who ever did." Students laughed gently. Teachers smiled. Benton didn't name the student. But his eyes had not left Marcus. After the lecture, while most students filed out, Marcus turned to leave. But Benton descended from the stage, moving toward him. Several teachers paused to watch. Principal Whitaker, standing at the back of the room, narrowed his gaze. "Marcus Johnson," Benton said, his voice neither loud nor soft. "I'll be damned." Marcus gave a polite nod. "Professor, it's been a long time." "Yes," Marcus replied. "It has." They stood in silence for a moment. The auditorium slowly emptied. "I always wondered what happened to you," Benton said. "No forwarding address. You disappeared. No thesis defense. I chose not to fight the current," Marcus replied. It seemed more honest. Benton's expression sobered. "You should have let me speak for you." They twisted it. "I let the silence speak instead," Marcus said. Whitaker approached then, arms crossed, a thin smile on his face. "I see you two know each other," he said. Benton nodded. "Marcus was my student. One of the most gifted I ever had." "Interesting," Whitaker said, the word laced with suspicion. "Background?" "He never mentioned an academic." Marcus said nothing. Benton looked between the two men. "Whatever your role is now, Marcus, you've always had the mind of a scholar. Don't let anyone make you forget that." He turned and left, his briefcase swinging at his side. Whitaker watched him go, then turned back to Marcus. That was quite the revelation. Marcus met his eyes. It changes nothing. Does it? Whitaker asked, his voice quiet. Or does it explain everything? He walked away without waiting for an answer. By the end of the day, word had spread. Staff who had never spoken to Marcus approached him now with tentative politeness. Some offered praise for Benton's lecture, and by extension for Marcus himself. A few simply stared, unable to reconcile the man before them with the quiet figure they had ignored for years. But in the principal's office, a different conversation took place. Whitaker summoned Mrs. Clark once more. "He's hiding something," he said. Clark frowned. "Or he's protecting something." "I want his records," Whitaker said. "The full history. Academic, legal, everything. That's not protocol." "I don't care. We'll find a way." He pointed to a printout on his desk. A 10-year-old article about an academic scandal, mostly redacted. "There's something here. A connection." And just like that, the quiet war escalated. Marcus returned home that evening and stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The lines around his eyes had deepened. The gray in his beard spread farther. But his eyes were steady. He had been seen. He had been remembered. And now they would come for the truth. The days that followed the lecture moved like a tightly wound pendulum, each swing slower and heavier, each moment thick with tension. Marcus continued his duties in the same quiet, steady rhythm he had always maintained, but beneath that surface was a current of watchfulness. He had expected attention after the auditorium encounter with Professor Benton, but what he hadn't anticipated was the way the pressure would compound, spreading from the principal to the vice principal, and now to the corridors themselves. Mrs. Penelope Clark, once a largely procedural figure in the background of administrative affairs, emerged now with a new focus. Her interactions with Marcus had always been brief, professional, defined by boundaries, neither warm nor cold. But after Benton's lecture, her presence shifted. She began appearing at locations where Marcus worked, not overtly supervising but always nearby, reviewing staff checklists, inspecting maintenance logs, examining supply inventories. Each time she acted as though she had a reason to be there. Each time Marcus knew otherwise. It wasn't long before she began asking questions, not to Marcus, but to others. One of the cafeteria workers mentioned it in passing. She asked where. "You're from," the man said, wiping down a counter. "Not Ohio? I told her I didn't know. A substitute teacher mentioned a conversation in the break room. She said you had a colorful past, whatever that means." Even the librarian, whose approval had once been subtle and genuine, now watched him with veiled hesitation, as though re-evaluating each past interaction. But the real blow came on a Wednesday morning, when Marcus arrived early to begin his routine and found a sealed envelope waiting in his locker. It was an official request, signed by both Principal Whitaker and Vice Principal Clark, for the release of his complete employment and academic history through district channels. The justification listed was professional alignment and administrative verification. The words were clinical. The intent was not. He folded the paper and placed it back in the envelope. No response was required because their quest was already in motion. By that afternoon, he was pulled from his routine to assist, with a faculty meeting set up. The multi-purpose room was to be arranged for an all-staff address, scheduled for the following morning. As he laid out chairs and adjusted microphone cables, Mrs. Clark entered and watched in silence for a long time before finally speaking. "You handled yourself well with Benton," she said. Marcus didn't pause in his task. "Thank you." She walked slowly among the rows of chairs, her heels soft against the tile. "You understand the position this puts the school in," she said. Marcus looked at her. "I understand the position you've decided I put you in." She stopped. "There's a difference between being underestimated and being dishonest," she said carefully. "One inspires curiosity, the other causes distrust. And what have I been dishonest about? Nothing, perhaps. But you've withheld context. That can be just as damaging." He returned to the cables. "You were a scholar," she continued. "Now you're a janitor. That contrast alone is enough to create friction. Add a scandal from the past, any past, and the situation becomes more than uncomfortable. It becomes unstable." Marcus stood and faced her fully. "Do you think stability is built on silence?" Clark tilted her head slightly. "Predictable. I think institutions prefer predictability. And right now, you are not." She turned and walked. Away, her parting words quiet but pointed. "You should prepare for what happens when the rest of your story comes out." That night, Marcus sat in his apartment, the city lights flickering softly through the blinds. He opened the folder from his drawer and reviewed each page again, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to see what they would soon hold in their hands. His academic record was spotless: valedictorian honors, early graduation, research accolades. But the final chapter was inked in ambiguity: the formal censure, the unresolved investigation, the unspoken exile. He remembered the day he chose not to fight it. The dean had offered him a chance to retract his accusation, a formal protest Marcus had filed after discovering falsified citations and unauthorized edits in a paper co-authored by a tenured professor. A quiet resolution had been promised, but Marcus refused. He submitted his findings. Within a month, the university had turned cold. Funding vanished. Recommendations evaporated. His thesis defense was postponed indefinitely, then cancelled. He was never expelled, never charged, just erased. And now the echo of that decision had followed him to Jefferson High. 2 days later, another envelope arrived, this time addressed to administration, but left open on the front office desk. A careless placement, or perhaps a deliberate one. Marcus passed by and glimpsed his name on the top of the form: Marcus L. Johnson, Academic File Summary. ILO note was clipped to the front. Includes disciplinary flag from University Review Board. The secretary noticed his glance and quickly covered the folder. Whitaker called him in that afternoon. The principal sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, eyes calculating. "We've received your background report," he said. Marcus remained silent. "There's mention of a university incident," Whitaker continued. "Integrity in a professional setting." "Serious enough to question your—" "I was never charged," Marcus replied evenly. "I was punished for exposing misconduct." Whitaker leaned back in his chair. "That's not how it reads. It reads like someone who burned bridges, someone who couldn't adapt to authority. And yet I've served this school with absolute discipline and loyalty. For now." A pause filled the room. "I'm placing you on administrative observation," Whitaker said. "Pending further review." Marcus nodded once. "Understood." As he stood to leave, Whitaker added, "You should have stayed in your lane." Marcus paused at the door. "And you should have read the whole file," he said. "The truth is in the footnotes." He left the office without waiting for a reply. Outside, the spring wind stirred the trees gently. The school stood tall, brick and steel, in memory. But Marcus knew something else now. They had declared war and he was done hiding. The first thing Marcus did after receiving the notification of administrative observation was to return home and unlock a box he hadn't touched in nearly 6 years. It sat beneath a shelf of dusty books, camouflaged by time and silence. Inside were the echoes of another life, copies of academic publications, with his name listed first, notes in the margins, of journal articles, letters, of endorsement from professors long retired or long indifferent. At the very bottom, wrapped in a protective sleeve, was the original copy of the formal complaint he had filed against his former university colleague, the one that had erased him from academia. He reread it once, then again, not with regret or second-guessing, but with an old familiarity, like revisiting a childhood street after years away. The facts hadn't changed. The language still held. The evidence remained sound. What had changed was his willingness to speak. The next morning, Marcus arrived early. He wore his uniform as always, but beneath it, the weight of purpose made his steps firmer. He began his routine in the science wing, double-checking the janitorial checklist, replacing filters, tightening a loose doorknob. Every task he performed with his usual quiet excellence, but every interaction that morning was different. Teachers looked at him not with suspicion, but expectation. Students whispered more now, not because they feared scandal, but because they sensed a story beneath the surface. By mid-morning, he made a decision. He sought out 3 individuals in the school he trusted, not because they had defended him before, but because they had listened. The librarian, Ms. Henry, the counselor, Ms. Alvarez, and Mr. Griffin, an English teacher known for his quiet empathy and stubborn independence from administrative politics. They met during lunch in a corner of the staff lounge. Marcus stood while the others sat, his back straight, his voice calm. "I need to tell you something," he began. "Something I should have said a long time ago." He unfolded a photocopy of his original university complaint and placed it on the table. "In another life, I was a doctoral candidate. I had nearly completed my thesis in comparative linguistics when I discovered a pattern of academic misconduct involving one of my supervisors. The evidence was clear: fabricated sources, manipulated citations, even portions of student work republished without attribution." He looked at their faces, serious, attentive, not shocked but saddened. "I filed a report. I thought the system would correct itself. Instead, I was warned, then sidelined. The faculty closed ranks. My defense was delayed indefinitely. Funding dried up. I was never formally expelled, but I was no longer welcome." Ms. Henry leaned forward. "So you walked away?" "I walked into a life that let me breathe again," Marcus said. "Shadows. But I never stopped carrying the truth. One where I wasn't fighting." He pulled out a second paper, a notarized letter from a now retired professor corroborating his version of events. "I didn't lose my career. I let go of a place that refused to honor it." Mr. Griffin picked up the documents and scanned them silently. "I'm telling you now because I know what they're planning. They're trying to paint me as unstable, insubordinate, deceptive. They want to rewrite my silence into guilt." Ms. Alvarez shook her head slowly. "They won't win." "I don't need protection," Marcus said. "I need the truth to exist. Beyond my hands." That afternoon, Ms. Henry requested a meeting with the student newspaper advisor. Mr. Griffin asked to address his department about the treatment of classified staff. Ms. Alvarez drafted a letter to the district counselor liaison outlining concerns about administrative overreach and the mistreatment of support personnel. By the end of the week, the mood in the school had shifted again. Rumors about Marcus's past were replaced by facts, passed quietly through staff meetings and lunch conversations. His name began to represent something more than curiosity. It became a rallying point. Other staff members began to share their own stories of academic derailment, of institutions that had abandoned them for speaking out. The walls of silence began to crack, and then came the unexpected call. It was a late Friday afternoon when the front office received a message from a national education journal. A reporter had been forwarded a statement written by Mr. Griffin describing the situation at Jefferson High. It mentioned Marcus only briefly, but the response was immediate. The reporter requested an interview, not with the teacher, with Marcus. He declined at first, then reconsidered. He met the reporter in a quiet corner of a local cafe, off school grounds, away from prying eyes. The reporter, a woman in her 40s, with a background in investigative education pieces, asked only one question to start. "Why now?" Marcus answered with a steady gaze. "Because truth isn't a spotlight, it's a mirror, and for too long I let mine collect dust." He told her everything, not for glory, not for vengeance, but for clarity. He gave her copies of documents, names of professors, timelines. He asked her to verify each piece independently. She promised to do so. By Monday, word of the interview had reached the school. Principal Whitaker summoned Marcus immediately. "You're going public now." Whitaker asked, incredulous. "I've been silent long enough," Marcus said. "You're damaging the school's image." "I'm clarifying mine." Whitaker leaned forward. "This could end your job here. Then it ends. But it won't end the truth." That night, Marcus returned home, removed his uniform, and sat in front of the mirror. For the first time in years, he felt no weight in his chest. He was no longer the custodian hiding from his past. He was the man reclaiming it. It began with a headline: "Custodian or Controversy? Jefferson High employee tied to academic scandal." The article ran in the Sunday edition of the city's largest local paper. Written by an anonymous staff contributor, it lacked the clarity and balance of the educational journalist Marcus had spoken with. Instead, it leaned into speculation, dragging old accusations to the surface without context, quoting unnamed district sources who expressed concern about Marcus's murky academic past. The piece mentioned disciplinary action, suggested misconduct, and heavily implied that Marcus had been forced out of academia for behavior that raised ethical questions. There were no direct allegations, just enough insinuation to soil a reputation. The effect was immediate. By Monday morning, the article had spread through the school like wildfire. Staff passed it around in printed form, their expressions tight with discomfort. Students shared it on social media. Some laughed, others questioned. A few approached Marcus directly, asking if it was true. He answered only with silence. When he entered the building that morning, something had changed. His keycard worked, but the administrative access it once provided had been limited. His custodial route was reduced to common areas. Tasks that used to fall under his responsibility were now reassigned to others without explanation. The other janitors didn't speak to him, eyes averted. Even the secretary, who once greeted him with a faint smile, now looked away when he walked past the front office. At the morning meeting, Principal Whitaker addressed the faculty with a carefully rehearsed statement. As many of you have seen, recent media coverage has cast attention on one of our support staff members. Let me be clear, we take all concerns seriously. The district is reviewing the matter and will act according to its findings. In the meantime, I urge everyone to maintain professionalism and let the process play out. There was no mention of Marcus's name, but everyone knew Marcus was called. To the principal's office shortly after lunch, he walked in and stood silently as Whitaker gestured toward a chair. Mrs. Clark was already seated, her hands folded on her lap. "You've seen the article?" Whitaker asked. "I have," Marcus replied. "Then you understand why this situation has escalated. It escalated when you made it your mission to dig into my past." Whitaker ignored the comment. "The district is placing you on temporary suspension, effective immediately, pending a full review. This is not a disciplinary action," he added quickly, "but a measure to protect the integrity of the school environment." Marcus remained motionless. "Do you have anything to say?" Clark asked. "I've always done my job. I've always acted with integrity. If your concern is reputation, then the only one damaged is yours for trying to silence me." Whitaker leaned forward, his voice tightening. "You brought this on yourself." Marcus stood slowly. "No," he said. "You brought it to light because you couldn't stand that someone without your credentials earned more respect in a moment than you have in years." He turned and left the office, walking through the halls, with steady steps, past students who now looked at him as if he were a puzzle they hadn't been taught how to solve. He exited through the back door, where spring sunlight filtered through the trees, soft and indifferent to human politics. The week that followed was one of silence and separation. Marcus stayed in his apartment, avoiding the news, avoiding phone calls. The folder of documents remained on his desk, untouched. His apartment was still. He moved through his day with the habits of someone who had lived through public scrutiny before. Eat little, speak less, trust no one quickly. But the silence didn't last. On Wednesday, a knock came at the door. When he opened it, a man stood on the threshold, clean-cut in his 50s, with a briefcase and a calm expression. "My name is Dr. Leonard Shu," he said. "I used to be your colleague. May I come in?" Marcus hesitated, then stepped aside. Shu was a former professor from the same university Marcus had once attended. They had co-authored a minor paper on dialect evolution years ago. They hadn't spoken since Marcus left. "I saw the article," Shu said, taking a seat, "and I saw what it left out." Marcus said nothing. "There are people coming forward now. Not many, but enough. Your story is beginning to reach the right ears. Some of us remember what happened, even if we stayed silent at the time." Marcus looked at him. "Why speak now?" "Because silence, in the end, is a kind of complicity. I've already written a statement to the district. I'd like to submit it publicly too, not as a defense, as a correction." Marcus nodded slowly. When Sue left, Marcus returned to his desk and began typing. He wrote not a defense, but a declaration, a clear, chronological explanation of the events that had led to his departure from academia. He named names. He cited documents, He explained the choices he had made, the cost he had paid, and the silence he had chosen not out of guilt but exhaustion, and he ended the statement with a single line, "I chose honesty over career. I live with that decision every day." He submitted the statement to the district review board, copied the school administration, and sent a copy to the same journalist who had requested the first interview. Then he waited. 2 days later, a new article appeared. From scholar to custodian, the man behind the silence. It was measured, factual, and piercing. It quoted verified documents. It included Shu's testimony, along with corroboration from 2 other former academics. It detailed the retaliation Marcus had faced and the quiet dignity with which he had rebuilt a life. The impact was immediate. Students read the article aloud in the cafeteria. Teachers who had avoided him now spoke his name with respect. Messages arrived in Marcus's inbox, some from strangers, some from old colleagues. Apologies, gratitude, solidarity. The school district, under pressure from public response, scheduled a hearing. Marcus would have his voice not in whispers or rumors, but in the open. And this time, vestige would not be given to those who thrived in shadows. It would belong to the man who had always told the truth, even when no one wanted to hear it. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday at the district's central administration building, a tall glass and brick structure that resembled a courthouse more than a center of education. Marcus arrived early, dressed not in his uniform but in a dark blazer, a simple shirt beneath and well-worn shoes polished to a muted shine. In his hand he carried a single leather folder. Inside were not just documents, but fragments of the story he had finally chosen to tell. Evidence, timelines, names, and signatures from the past resurfaced to confront the present. The hearing room was functional and sterile. A long table, a dozen chairs, a digital recorder blinking silently at the end. A panel of 7 district representatives sat opposite Marcus, each equipped with tablets, folders, and prepared statements. Principal Whitaker was present as a witness, flanked by Mrs. Clark. A district legal advisor observed from the corner, her eyes sharp behind frameless glasses. The session began with a formal reading of the concerns brought forth by the article and its implications on the school's environment. The district cited Marcus's lack of transparency regarding his academic past, the disruption caused by media attention, and the potential erosion of institutional trust. But as each accusation was read, Marcus listened with an almost meditative calm, waiting, measuring, knowing that this was not a trial. It was the end of assailants that had lasted too long. When given the floor, Marcus stood and opened his folder. He did not look at the papers. Instead, he looked at the people. "I have been called a risk," he began, "an anomaly, even a deception. But what I truly am is Amen, who once believed that truth had a voice in institutions built on knowledge. That belief cost me everything I had worked for, not because I was wrong, but because I refused to stay quiet." He told them of the complaint he had filed at the university, the evidence he had submitted, the subtle campaign of erasure that followed. He explained how the academic body had chosen to protect itself rather than its integrity. He described his decision to leave not as defeat, but as survival. And then he recounted how he had rebuilt, not in lecture halls or journals, but in classrooms filled with students he supported in silence, sweeping floors so their paths would be clear, fixing what was broken so their learning wouldn't pause. He handed copies of letters from former professors, now publicly admitting the validity of his past claims. He presented signed declarations from colleagues at Jefferson High, confirming his professional conduct, his respect among students, and the positive impact of his presence. The panel listened. Some nodded. Others took notes. One member, a former teacher herself, kept her eyes on Marcus the entire time, her expression unreadable but steady. When he finished, Marcus sat down without fanfare. Then Whitaker stood. With practiced composure, he reiterated the original justification for the suspension, the school's need for stability, the disruption Marcus's story had caused, and the media frenzy that followed. He did not raise his voice. He used terms like professional boundaries and public confidence, phrases designed to sound objective but aimed with surgical precision. He implied that Marcus had manipulated sympathy and that his resurgence into public attention had made the administration's job harder. But the room did not echo with support. When Mrs. Clark rose to speak, her tone was different. She did not attack. Instead, she voiced concern over process and policy, cautioning the district against reacting emotionally rather than procedurally. It was clear she sought a middle path, to avoid confrontation without endorsing either side fully. But her words landed with less weight than she might have hoped. The final statements were made. The panel thanked everyone and adjourned for deliberation. Marcus stepped outside into the courtyard. The spring breeze was light, the sun mild. He found a bench and sat, waiting, not just for the decision, but for the quiet that often followed. Truth. That peculiar stillness when the world pauses to absorb something it had long avoided. He wasn't alone for long. Ms. Alvarez, the counselor, approached and sat beside him without speaking at first. Then she said, "There are students asking when you'll come back, not if it, when." Marcus smiled faintly. Mr. Griffin joined them soon after, bringing coffee. Then Ms. Henry from the library. Word spread quickly through text threads and whispered, "Updates." A small group gathered near the courtyard edge. Teachers, aides, even a few parents who had quietly followed the articles. No one held signs, no one chanted, but their presence was louder than protest. 2 hours later, the panel reconvened. The verdict was delivered without preamble. Marcus Johnson was to be reinstated immediately, with full duties and a formal apology, issued by the district for the premature suspension. Furthermore, the board recommended that a new staff inclusion initiative be launched, led by Marcus, to bridge cultural and professional divides within the school. Whitaker said nothing. Mrs. Clark only nodded once, her face unreadable. Marcus accepted with a measured calm. He shook hands, thanked the board, and stepped out into the afternoon with his folder still in hand. When he returned to Jefferson High the next morning, the building greeted him differently. There were no banners, no applause. But there was respect, in the way the front office staff looked up and made eye contact, in the quiet nods from teachers in the hall, in the subtle shift of posture when students passed him. His uniform was waiting in the locker. He put it on, adjusted the name tag, and began his rounds. In the library, a group of students sat discussing a French novel. One of them looked up and said, "Hey, Mr. Johnson, you got a second? This translation's weird." He walked over, read the line and smiled. "It's not weird," he said, "it's layered. Let me show you." It was a rare moment in Jefferson High's calendar, a school-wide assembly held not for celebration or warning, but for reckoning. The district had approved it, reluctantly at first, then officially, citing its potential for community healing and acknowledgement. But within the walls of the school, everyone knew the real reason. It was time to face the silence they had lived alongside, the silence Marcus had once embodied and had now broken. The gymnasium was prepared with care. Chairs filled the floor in orderly rows. The bleachers were pulled out, filled with students. From every grade, faculty members took their places along the sidelines, some stiff with discomfort, others watchful, waiting. A podium stood at the front, flanked by 2 modest flags, one of the nation, one of the school. The morning light filtered through high windows, catching dust particles in quiet spirals. It felt less like a school function and more like a civic moment, heavy with the weight of something unsaid finally being invited into the open. Principal Whitaker opened the assembly with a scripted introduction. His tone was crisp, his words polished. He referenced the importance of transparency in education, of honoring diverse paths of service, and the need to learn from challenges. He never mentioned Marcus by name, but the subtext was unmistakable. The air shifted slightly as he stepped aside, applause polite, brief. Then the counselor, Ms. Alvarez, stepped forward. Her words came not from notes but from memory. She spoke of listening, of how institutions often failed those who chose humility over noise, how quiet strength could be mistaken for passivity, and how redemption was never about erasing the past, but recognizing its full shape. When Marcus finally walked to the podium, the gym was silent. He wore his uniform, not because he had to, but because he chose to. It was freshly laundered, ironed, his name tag polished. As he stood before hundreds of students, teachers, staff and administrators, he paused, letting the quiet breathe. "I was asked to speak today," he began. "Has seen something it wasn't prepared to explain. Not because I demanded it, but because this school," he glanced around the room, not hurried, not dramatic, simply present. "I've walked these halls for years, cleaned your classrooms, fixed your doors, listened to your conversations in passing, smiled when you passed me without seeing. And I never resented it, not once. Because I knew something most of you didn't. I was choosing this." He let that settle. "I came here after a different life, one filled with books, lectures, academic debates, and the sharp burn of betrayal. I walked away from it not because I was defeated, but because I refused to stay in a system that punished truth." He described briefly the events that led him away from his doctorate, the complaint he filed, the professional exile that followed. He didn't dwell on bitterness, nor did he ask for sympathy. His voice never rose. Instead, it deepened with clarity. "I came here to work with my hands, but I never stopped thinking or reading or remembering what I believed about education. That it's not just about what's taught, but what's lived." There was stillness in the room, not of apathy, but of respect. Marcus continued, "You might have heard things about me. Some true, some not. But what matters now is what you do with what you've learned. Whether you'll look at the people around you, the ones who serve, who repair, who keep your world running, and ask who they are, not just what they do." He spoke then of resilience, of how intelligence wasn't limited to titles or credentials, of how some of the most brilliant minds he had met worked quietly in corners, never asked to speak. He challenged the students to think critically, to question authority with integrity, to be brave enough to risk misunderstanding in pursuit of truth. "You don't have to be loud to be right," he said. "You just have to stand." As he finished, he didn't ask for applause. He stepped away from the podium and walked back to his place at the edge of the gym, just another man in uniform. The applause came anyway. It started softly, scattered, then grew, louder, sustained, rippling from students to staff. Some stood, others followed. It wasn't a roar of triumph, it was a rising of acknowledgement for a man who had always been there, invisible by choice and circumstance, now visible by truth. After the assembly, Marcus returned to work. He replaced filters in the science wing. He tightened a radiator valve in the cafeteria. He walked the halls as he always had, but now students greeted him by name. Teachers nodded with deliberate respect. Even the security guard offered a handshake. Later, that afternoon, Marcus passed Whitaker in the corridor. The principal said nothing, but his eyes lingered longer than before, not with malice, but with reluctant recognition. That evening, a letter appeared in the school's online portal. Written by the superintendent, it detailed the events of the past weeks, the district's findings and the board's decision to endorse a new program focused on transparency, inclusion, and staff development, with Marcus as its coordinator. It was not a promotion in title but in function, a bridge between silence and voice. At home, Marcus removed his uniform, folded it carefully, and set it on the chair beside his bed. He looked out the window at the evening sky, the soft red clouds, like embers fading into blue. He had not planned this. He had only told the truth, but in doing so he had become more than a custodian of flaws. He had become a custodian of memory, of resistance, of the quiet, unbreakable will to remain whole in a world that had once tried to erase him. In the weeks that followed the assembly, a quiet revolution unfolded within the walls of Jefferson High. Not the kind of upheaval marked by slogans or protests, but something subtler, the slow dismantling of assumptions, the reshaping of perspective. The students who had once seen Marcus as little more than a fixture now saw him as a figure worth listening to. The staff who had walked past him for years began pausing, speaking, seeking his insight on matters far beyond maintenance or repair. Change, it turned out, did not always require force. Sometimes it began with a story told in an even voice, heard by those ready to listen. Marcus embraced his new role without ceremony. The district had given the program a tentative name, Multicultural and Linguistic Support Coordinator. But Marcus cared little for titles. Hectored for what the position allowed, a platform to bring visibility to those often unseen. He still cleaned when needed, still fixed things with his hands. But now, between classes and after hours, he sat with students struggling in silence, advised staff navigating cultural gaps in the classroom, and collaborated with teachers to make the school more than just a place of instruction. One of his first initiatives was simple: a series of weekly workshops titled Untranslated. Each session explored language not just as a means of communication, but as a vessel of identity. The sessions were open to all, voluntary, informal. The first one drew fewer than 10 participants. By the fourth week, the room was filled beyond capacity. Students shared phrases from home, expressions untranslatable in English, each a window into a different world. Marcus facilitated, not as a lecturer but as a bridge, connecting meanings, drawing parallels, asking questions others hadn't thought to ask. Mr. Griffin, the English teacher who had long supported Marcus, offered to co-host a session on poetry across languages. The collaboration sparked new curriculum ideas. Soon, a small group of teachers began crafting a new elective: Language, Power and Identity. It was set to launch the following semester, with Marcus listed as an official consultant. It was a modest title, but an unprecedented acknowledgement. Despite the growing respect, Principal Whitaker's demeanor remained unchanged. He attended none of the sessions. He made no public statements. He delegated interactions with Marcus to Mrs. Clark, who herself had begun to shift subtly, no longer adversarial, now cautiously cooperative. She met with Marcus weekly to review updates on the program, often nodding through his reports, asking questions that revealed more curiosity than skepticism. Trust, Marcus understood, was not immediate, but its seeds had been planted. One afternoon, Clark lingered after their meeting. "You've managed to accomplish more in 2 months than some initiatives have in 2 years, she said. Marcus responded. Evenly. People were ready, they just needed space. She hesitated, then added, "There's talk at the district level, they're watching closely." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "They're considering expanding the program district-wide, using Jefferson as a model." He said nothing, but his silence was not from surprise. It was from understanding. Not all reactions were positive. A few faculty members still whispered about the media storm, still questioned the wisdom of letting. A former academic with a controversial past shaped student programs, but their voices were becoming isolated. The tide was turning not by force but by example. Students, especially those who had felt invisible, first-generation immigrants, non-native English speakers, those from marginalized backgrounds, began seeking Marcus out. They shared their stories, asked his advice, confided their fears about college, about identity, about being enough. He never gave grand speeches. He listened, asked questions, offered what guidance he could. And each conversation layered another stone in the foundation he was quietly building. One day, a senior named Layla approached him after a session. "Want to study linguistics," she said, "to be born into it." "I didn't even know it was a thing before. I thought you had." Marcus smiled. "No one's born into it. We all learn our way there." She hesitated. "Do you think someone like me could do it?" He looked her in the eyes. "I think someone like you is exactly who should." Moments like that became common. Quiet, profound, and transformative. Outside the walls of the school, the broader community began to take notice. A local podcast invited Marcus to speak. A state education board representative visited one of the workshops. A regional news outlet ran a follow-up story, this time focusing not on scandal, but on the innovation taking root in an Ohio high school where a janitor had helped reimagine how language could unite rather than divide. Through it all, Marcus remained steady. He did not seek accolades. He returned each evening to his modest apartment, still walked to school before sunrise, still read academic papers late at night. But something within him had shifted. The shame he once carried like a stone in his chest had begun to lift, not because the past was erased, but because it had finally been faced. He often thought about the irony, that in fleeing academia to avoid the echo of betrayal, he'd found his truest intellectual purpose in a place that had never asked for it, among people who had not expected it, in corridors that once overlooked him entirely. One morning, while adjusting a projector in a classroom, he overheard a student whisper to another, "That's Marcus. He's the one who translated that French thing." And then, changed the whole school. Marcus smiled faintly and walked on. He hadn't changed the school. He had reminded it what stories were hiding in plain sight. The final days of the academic year arrived quietly, threaded with anticipation and exhaustion. Jefferson High buzzed with the usual end-of-term rituals: last-minute assignments, final exams, teacher checklists, and the inevitable scramble to close the year without chaos. Yet amid the familiar routines, something else lingered, a subtle reverence for the changes that had unfolded over the past months. The school had been reshaped, not through policy or leadership mandates, but through the persistent, unflinching presence of a man who had once pushed a mop in silence. Marcus still walked the same halls. His steps carried the same pace, his shoulders the same posture, but the way others moved around him had changed. Teachers now stopped him, not just for building concerns, but for insight. Students greeted him with genuine respect, some even requesting his help with translations or asking about careers in language. The once invisible figure had become integral, not a symbol, not a story, but a part of the school's daily rhythm. As coordinator of the newly named Language and Inclusion Initiative, Marcus had overseen more than just workshops. He had facilitated partnerships with nearby universities, coordinated summer opportunities for multilingual students, and helped draft a new district-wide policy on staff inclusion. But perhaps most importantly, he had fostered something less tangible and more enduring: the courage to question assumptions, to ask who people really were beneath the surface. One afternoon, while cleaning out a storage room near the library, Marcus found an old bulletin board covered with faded announcements, torn flyers, and forgotten schedules. He paused before it, studying the layers of paper like a stratigraphy of memory. Buried beneath outdated postings, he uncovered a black and white photo from nearly 2 decades prior. A group of students smiling outside the school building, their faces youthful, exuberant, unaware of time's passage. He recognized one of the students. It was Whitaker. He removed the photo gently, brushed off the dust, and placed it in an envelope. The next morning, he delivered it to the principal's office. Whitaker accepted it without a word. His expression was unreadable as he turned the photo over in his hand. Marcus didn't stay to explain. He simply nodded and left. That same week, Mrs. Clark invited Marcus to a staff luncheon honoring the year's milestones. It was the first formal recognition of his role in any official capacity. The room was decorated with modest banners, the kind of event that usually passed without much emotion. But when Clark stood to speak, she did not recite the usual accolades. This year, we learned that education is not confined to titles, and that wisdom often comes from where we least expect it, she said, her eyes drifting toward Marcus. We were reminded that dignity is not a function of role but of character, and in that reminder, we've all become better educators. The applause that followed was not obligatory. It was genuine. Later that day, Marcus received an envelope from the district office. Inside was a formal offer to expand the Language and Inclusion Initiative across multiple schools, with Marcus at the helm as district coordinator. The offer came with flexibility, autonomy, and resources, and with it a decision. He sat with it for days. He thought of the janitor's closet he once called his home base, the squeaky cart, the broken light he fixed 3 times in room 211. He thought of the students who had spoken their truth in his sessions, of the teacher who first asked cautiously if he could help revise a curriculum. He thought of the long silence that had kept him hidden and the gentle courage it took to step back into the light. And then he thought of the halls, not as corridors of labor, but of witness. On the final day of school, as students streamed out with yearbooks and goodbyes, Marcus remained behind. He visited every wing, every room, not with tools, but with a sense of closure. He walked the east hallway where he first spoke French aloud. He stood outside the front office where Whitaker once challenged him with a translation test. He paused by the auditorium where Benton had called him by name. And finally, he returned to the library, where a shelf now bore a plaque reading, "In honor of Marcus L. Johnson, for reminding us that knowledge, like language, is always waiting to be heard. As he stood reading it, Layla approached, the student who once asked if someone like her could study linguistics. "I got in," she said, breathless. "Full scholarship. I'm going." Marcus smiled. "You earned it," he said. "I want to." "Do what you did," she said. "No," he replied gently. "Do more. Do it louder." She laughed, nodded, and disappeared into the sea of departing students. That evening, Marcus sat at his desk and wrote his response to the district. He accepted the position, not to leave Jefferson behind, but to extend what he had built. His last sentence read, "I will serve where I'm needed, but I will always belong to the hallways that remembered me." Outside, the sky darkened into a soft summer dusk. The school stood quiet, doors locked, lights dimmed. But inside its walls, the echoes of one man's journey had become part of its foundation, and the halls, once indifferent, now carried his steps like memory. The summer ceremony was unlike any event Jefferson High had hosted before. It wasn't part of the usual end-of-year festivities, not tied to any academic calendar or district requirement. It had been suggested by the student council and quietly supported by the faculty. Officially, it was labeled as a community recognition event, but to those who filled the auditorium that evening, it meant something far more personal. It was about closure, about celebration, about finally saying what had long gone unsaid. The auditorium stage was modestly prepared. A simple podium, a line of folding chairs, and a projection screen displaying a single phrase, "Stories matter." Students, families, teachers, and alumni filled the seats. Some came in formal dress, others in casual summer clothes. The air was filled with anticipation, not of performance, but of tribute. The principal, Daniel Whitaker, opened the evening with a tone notably different from his usual public addresses. His voice was steady but subdued, his remarks shorter than expected. "This year reminded us that schools are not only places of learning," he said. "They are places where we are constantly unlearning our biases, our assumptions, our roles. Tonight, we recognize someone who helped us all do just that." There was no applause when he stepped down, only a shared silence as Marcus was called to the stage. He walked up in the same quiet way he had moved through the school for years. No suit, no special attire, just a clean shirt, slacks, and his name, worn like a badge of memory. When he reached the microphone, he looked out at the crowd. Faces he knew, faces he had once passed without notice, faces that had changed with time. "I never imagined this," Marcus began, "not because I doubted what people could become, but because I never thought I'd be seen for who I had been." He paused, letting the room breathe with him. "I've worked in silence for most of my life, first in libraries, then in lecture halls, then in these corridors. And I've come to understand that silence isn't always the absence of voice. Sometimes, it's the waiting place of truth." He told them of the journey, now familiar to many but still carrying the power of quiet resilience. He spoke not of betrayal, but of rebuilding, not of anger, but of endurance. He acknowledged those who had believed in him and those who hadn't without bitterness. "Education," he said, "is not the transmission of facts. It is the awakening of understanding. And sometimes that awakening happens in places where no one's looking, in broom closets, in cafeterias, in quiet walks home." He looked toward the students, his voice low but unwavering. The applause that followed was unlike the earlier celebrations. It was not perfunctory, not prompted. It was honest, rising gradually, then swelling into a standing ovation. Marcus did not bow. He simply stood, then stepped back as others took the stage to honor him, not just with words but with actions. A scholarship was announced in his name, to be awarded annually to a student pursuing studies in language, translation, or cultural equity. A mural was unveiled in the school's East Wing, not a portrait, but a tapestry of multilingual phrases submitted by students, framed by the words, "Understanding begins when we listen to what we do not yet know." One of the last speakers was Layla, who had graduated just weeks before. "He didn't just help me find my path," she said, "to walk. He just cleared the dust from the signpost. He reminded me that the path was already mine." After the ceremony, people lingered. Parents approached him to shake his hand. Teachers thanked him for changing their classrooms. Former students, now, in college or pursuing careers, returned to share how his quiet presence had marked their lives in ways they hadn't understood at the time. Whitaker approached at last. He stood beside Marcus without preamble. "You proved me wrong," he said. Marcus offered a small smile, disappearing. "It was never about proving anything. It was about not," the principal nodded. "You've made this place better. I see that. Now." Marcus extended his hand. Whitaker shook it, firm and brief. When the building finally emptied, Marcus stood alone for a moment in the auditorium. The lights were dimmed, the chairs scattered with forgotten programs and folded notes. He walked down the central aisle slowly, each step echoing softly on the floor where his journey had once been invisible. Outside, the night was warm. The school stood tall behind him, its windows aglow with the last remnants of celebration. He did not look back. He didn't need to. The halls had spoken, and this time they remembered his name.